Fashion, whether as an industry, the trends within it, or when discussing personal style, carries political implications. Whether or not you prioritize shopping sustainably carries messages surrounding your social position and your political values. What type of clothing you wear in relation to subcultures carries political messages. Think about iconic styles such as the punks, mods, rockers, teddy boys. And even certain accessory choices are part of their own coded languages. Think about the code of Doc Marten lace colors and lacing styles and their handkerchief or hanky code. Fashion cycles and trends also speak to wider socio-political environments and movements. Many subcultures in the UK can be traced back to post-war Britain, where young people for the first time had an amount of disposable income due to an increased number of jobs and an increased importance placed on adolescence emerging as its own life stage rather than going from childhood straight into adulthood with adult responsibilities. As such, young people started to gain disposable income where they could gather socially and engage in fashion choices that were based on style. Similarly, we've seen in recent years how we place our political views on how we perceive fashion houses and how we can idealize fashion houses in celebrity culture until a scandal comes about to change that. Think about the scandal surrounding Balenciaga in recent years. Maya Singer for Vogue has an interesting take on the topic of fashion as politics, noting that fashion also conjures society's dreams, challenges its norms, and reflects back what it believes about itself. And yet the question persists, can fashion be political? To which the proper reply must be, wasn't it always? But what is it about fashion that creates it as a vessel for political and thus social commentary? Well, there are clear historical examples that come to mind for me. Think about the moralization of the ankle, especially in Victorian England, where women's fashion choices were policed in terms of propriety. Also, think about how movements such as the suffragettes utilized specific colours, sashes, rosettes, etc., to signify their political allegiances. In the UK, those colours were purple, white, and green, with purple standing for loyalty and dignity, white standing for purity, and green standing for hope. And the suffragettes would also utilise the commonality of dressing well in typically feminine styles of the time to create camaraderie and a common group identity. This type of clothing camaraderie in protest is something we see over and over again. For example, when the Black Lives Matter protests were occurring, everybody in attendance of these protests was encouraged to wear nondescript black clothing that would make them unidentifiable if they were to later be targeted by the police. Now, this was largely for safety concerns, but if you look back at footage, this does help to create a common identity and also takes away the implications of individuals in a whole group voice. Essentially, by removing identifiable aspects, bright colors, bold patterns, covering tattoos, they created a unity of voices amongst the protesters. Other examples of fashion and style being used in protest include the torn clothing, safety pins, and bold slogans of the punk movement in the 1970s in the UK. Once again, a common identity is formed, but also a resistant identity is formed, which opposed prevailing social norms and mainstream expression, ideas, and political stances. The DIY nature of this style also suggests the anti-consumerism views of this particular subculture. And of course, there are also political connotations related to race, gender, religion, sexuality, just to name a few, that also come into this conversation of fashion as political and social commentary. And those connotations can range from political resistance to acts of allegiance. Think about the link between queer women and carabiners, or the typical bisexuals cuff their jeans argument. Yes, these are stereotypes, but they're rooted in the idea of embodying aspects of community to mark yourself to those in the know. We could also consider the iconography we associate with certain stock characters. Think the dark hair, brooding, leather jacket wearing, cigarette smoking bad boy. We know the type of character that person is meant to be by the messages sent by imaging, by fashion and styling. Nothing exists without connotation because we carry every experience we've had in the past into every experience we gain. So every first impression or opinion we have is formed by the connotations of imaging that we have gained by our own experiences in the past. And then, as I mentioned briefly, there's also the politics that surround fashion brands themselves. One I've made a video about is the rise, fall, and potential resuscitation of Victoria's Secret amongst inclusivity criticisms, leadership scandals, and overcorrection that focused too much on social criticisms that it almost forgot the actual essence of the brand that people loved. I will leave that video in the cards if you're interested in a deep dive into Victoria's Secret as a brand and the fashion show more broadly. But the cancellation of Victoria's Secret as a brand, seen in a loss of sales and a demotion in the social zeitgeist, suggests the importance of brand political allegiances for consumer engagement. Thus, we are shopping with our political allegiances in mind, creating where we purchase from as a political act. This is also seen in common discourse surrounding the moralization of shopping sustainably and the demonization of fast fashion shoppers. Now, I think this conversation we're having has kind of suffered this TikTok generation, have to have a hook in the first 3 seconds of a video, black and white, very strong opinion based content thought process that we have all become very used to and exposed to from TikTok because our attention span has shortened. We want quick, bite sized pieces of media to consume, and that often means they lack nuance. So I think a lot of the time, opinions surrounding fast fashion and shopping sustainably come down to virtue signaling because we have been told that to shop sustainably is good and you shouldn't shop fast fashion. Now, yes, for fair labor practices and for the environment, fast fashion is not good. It is not good. They are not industry leading in any capacity. They have detrimental side effects. Yes. This is why we've seen a distinct move away from influencers doing fast fashion giant hauls because that seems like a waste. It seems irresponsible purchasing, right? That's when it makes sense to demonize fast fashion shopping because that is someone who could afford to invest in better quality pieces, in advocating for fair labor practices by engaging with brands who promote such things. However, if someone cannot afford to purchase new things from sustainable brands, then I think we have to consider a nuance in this conversation. Not all fast fashion shopping has to be demonized in the same way. If someone is buying a few basic necessary pieces from a fast fashion brand because it's the cheapest option, because they can't physically get to a charity or thrift shop, or because they aren't going to be able to find their size in a charity or thrift shop, I do not think we should be tarring that with the same blanket statement as people who buy £500 worth of clothing from a fast fashion brand just to have quantity of clothing. Especially when you consider on platforms like Vinted, once you factor in shipping on each individual item you may need, a lot of the time those prices will be more expensive than fast fashion brands per item. And if people cannot afford those pricings, sometimes their only option is fast fashion. Rather than demonizing the shopper, we should definitely be demonizing the practices of the industry and holding them responsible far more than the shopper who is just trying to have some basic necessities. So there's a lot of political and social commentary held in fashion choices and clothing, both historically and currently. But fashion also carries economic implications. Both the beauty and fashion industries have been seen to create links between economic events and consumer patterns, so such as recessions happening. For example, before the Wall Street crash in the 1920s, we had short skirts and glitzy clothing, but by the 1930s, after the Wall Street crash, hemlines got longer and clothing became far more practical and was about lasting longer because people can afford to replace items or there weren't the resources to replace items. So this touches on something quite commonly known as the hemline index that suggests there is a direct correlation between the length of popular hemlines and the economic stability and situation of society. We can also see how post-war there was a shift towards traditionally feminine silhouettes, which talks to the social ideas of what a woman's place is which is not in the workforce, even though they largely banded together and contributed to traditionally male jobs in the war effort when men had gone off to war. And then once again, as we saw a move into second wave feminism, hemlines got shorter, the rise of the miniskirt occurred, and also we saw this rise in workwear for women, in the pantsuit, in practical clothing, and in trousers becoming popular in all facets of fashion and walks of life. And practicality and personal style began to prevail over ideas of propriety linked to clothing. Alongside this, famously, sales of lipsticks increase when a recession is coming. And I do wonder whether we can link the popularity of lip oils in recent years to the cost of living crisis that's been going on. And it's because they are small cosmetics that are relatively inexpensive that act as small luxuries in times of economic instability. As noted by Jack Kelly for Forbes, the lipstick index is based on the thought process that women tend to spend money on small luxuries that make them feel good when they feel economically insecure. And that desire for small luxuries perhaps suggests why, in terms of turbulent economic, political, and social circumstances, luxury lifestyles become romanticized and popularized in what type of media we look up to. I mean, we've seen this in recent years with the rise of the old money or quiet luxury aesthetic, in contrast to the flashy celebrity culture of the 2010s. And that's exactly what I want to talk about today. So let's deep dive into the quiet luxury aesthetic, the rise of Sofia Richie Grainge as the quiet luxury it girl, and the political moment in which all of this has risen to popularity. To understand the significance of Sofia Richie Grainge's rise to popularity in terms of trends and discourse, first let's explore a little bit about what quiet luxury actually is. So, what actually is quiet luxury? Well, in contrast to the flashy designer names and logos and labels that are associated with being status symbols, quiet luxury is instead a more understated and sophisticated turn to fashionable dressing. Notable to also be more conservative in nature, quiet luxury, such as seen popularized by Mary Kate and Ashley Olsen with their brand The Row, is all about timeless, well-made pieces that ooze sophistication. Is all about timeless, well-made pieces that ooze style without relying on overly obvious branding. It is a polished yet quality-based approach to style, and one where a lot of the time the brand's relevant you don't know unless you know. So quiet luxury looks to understated elegance and moves away from overconsumption, whilst highlighting quality tailoring rather than just simply dressing for comfort. And with such a focus on quality, it does not seem unreasonable to consider the connection between wealth and the quiet luxury aesthetic. I've heard people say that the people with wealth are wearing the brands you've never heard of, whilst the nouveau riche are wearing the well-known designer brands. As has become the colloquialism, money talks, but wealth whispers. One of the most well-known embodiments of the quiet luxury aesthetic, arguably the it girl face of the moment, is Sofia Richie Grainge. Now, if any of you are like me, your first introduction to Sofia Richie Grainge may have been when she was just simply Sofia Richie, daughter to Lionel Richie, sister to Nicole Richie of Simple Life fame, and girlfriend to Scott Disick. It was a controversial romance for sure, with a 15-year age gap, making Sofia Richie Grainge younger than the youngest Kardashian sibling. She is a year younger than Kylie, I believe. Not only was her style markedly different back then, but the associations of being around Scott Disick and by extension the Kardashian family is definitely far away from the fashion, lifestyle, and aesthetic she has rose to popularity with 3 years after that relationship. Quoting from Hanna Lustig's 2023 article for Glamour, the Sofia Richie effect is real. Here's what Sofia Richie Grainge's stylist, Liette Barouche, I'm so sorry if I said that wrong, had to say about her turn in fashion and styling. About 2 years ago, Richie tapped Barouche, her older sister Nicole's friend of 20 years, to develop a more timeless and elevated way of dressing. Together, they've built a core wardrobe around what we think will last and what we think is not going to be gross in 5 years when we look back, or even 2 years, or even 1 year, the stylist says. But I think it's important to consider a couple of factors here. Obviously, Sofia Richie Grainge has grown up around wealth. with famous parents and famous sister. And she's had the luxury of experimenting with herself and her style without the constraints of things like a corporate job or money restraints in what she has access to. Even the fact that her stylist is a friend of her sister's means that she both has economic and social connections that allow her to experiment with her styling in such a manner as she has. Because let's face it, she has access to resources, including time, that the average person would not. And that's when we have to consider the accessibility of something like a quiet luxury aesthetic. Are we trying to romanticize an aesthetic in popular discourse in the face of economic instability because that is what we hoped we could have? Similarly, we also have to consider that Sofia Richie Grainge's rise to it girl fame within this aesthetic comes from her already having a known name. Like I said, she's Lionel Richie's daughter, but I also knew her from the relationship she'd been in the media for in the past. And having the last name Richie means that she will just make headlines for what she does anyway. And that is where people will criticize Sofia Richie Grainge for being a Nepo baby, because she will make headlines and she can create a career off of her name itself. Now, I will explore that a little bit further when I get to talking about the appeal of Sofia Richie Grainge, because as much as you can have a name that people know in this day and age, you have to have authenticity and engagement, especially on social media, for people to truly care about you, and she has achieved that. So I don't think we can just claim that her success is based off her name, but I do think everyone's initial interest in her perhaps is linked to people knowing who she was in the first place. However, the approach in which Sofia Richie Grainge has emerged as an it girl of the quiet luxury aesthetic is arguably the perfect way to approach a rebrand and to authentically grab the attention of modern audiences. And that arrives directly as a result of Sofia Richie Grainge's approach to social media. In this day and age, social media is king of personal branding. That's just the way it is. It's no longer tabloid press, it's not paparazzi. That is not where most people get their celebrity news anymore. And some people would argue perhaps that it's not as significant. Celebrity news, celebrity gossip isn't as significant in the social popular discourse that we have these days, but it is. We just look to get it directly from celebrities themselves, and we look to them for authenticity rather than PR, media trained, curated versions of who they are in interviews on talk shows or planted in tabloids. Essentially, we want direct access, and social media is great for controlling personal branding in that capacity because we aren't relying on third parties to tell us about these celebrities anymore. But it also means we're exposed to a far wider range of people to follow and to engage with, and thus we aren't just sticking with the people that the press want to be popular, and instead can create popularity for individuals we find engaging. Thus, in the world of social media, engagement and engaging with an audience is so key. So how is it that Sofia Richie Grainge grabbed our attention? Well, she launched her TikTok after, from what I'm aware, was largely living kind of an under the radar, out of the public eye life post Scott Disick breakup, for her luxury, extravagant, beautiful wedding. And rather than waiting to release photos as part of a magazine deal and an editorial shoot, which celebrities get big money for, she opted to provide a more real time look into this wedding and the behind the scenes of it, just like your friend would post on their TikTok. And that kind of authenticity speaks directly to a Gen Z audience. From my experience, I'm Gen Z, I can only speak on kind of my generation, but we like that access, we like that authenticity, and that is engaging to us. It also meant that Sofia Richie Grainge could show off both her personality and her aesthetic in one. It humanized Sofia Richie Grainge and created personal authenticity in who she was and how she was engaging with social media, even if the actual luxury of the wedding itself was not something that was relatable to audiences. And the carefree and authentic nature of Sofia Richie Grainge on social media also adds to the personal authenticity for her of the quiet luxury aesthetic she is seen within, and creates her as an appealing personality to follow. I mean, people's intrigue with Sofia Richie Grainge can be seen when she had her baby and everyone was talking about the name she chose, Eloise. And suddenly there were so many conversations happening on social media about a return to more traditional baby names, in contrast to the slightly outrageous celebrity children's names that we saw come out in the earlier 2000s. Oh, an absolute massive side note right now, because this isn't really about the quiet luxury aesthetic, but we need to just talk about this. So recently, Sofia Richie Grainge has made headlines and discourse, and everyone's been talking about it on social media when she made a TikTok with her influencer BFF, Jake Shane, to Lola Young's Messy. And this was literally just her going in, it was a little shoulder to the beat, a little step. And everyone was like, it's the Sofia Richie Grainge dance. We need to learn to do this. This is the new dance. The woman has rhythm. But the fact that this obsession with the Sofia Richie Grainge dance came from something that I would argue, compared to TikTok dances, this is not a dance. This is a little movement. It's rhythm, people. It's rhythm. The shock that people had with this, the obsession they had with this, I think just speaks to how influential Sofia Richie Grainge is and the brand that she has established for herself is. It also made me really laugh that this is when people realized that Sofia Richie Grainge is not a white woman. She is Lionel Richie's daughter. Now, if you don't know who Lionel Richie is, here's a photo of Lionel Richie. This is her biological father. Some people get confused because I believe Nicole Richie was adopted. People suddenly, when she had rhythm, they were like, because she's white passing, people were like, stereotypically, white people do not have rhythm. What's going on? And people were so shocked to find out that Sofia Richie Grainge is not a white woman. Her father is a world-renowned artist who everyone knows is a black man. The observational skills sometimes I think are lacking a little bit amongst people, and also for a generation who has technology at our fingertips, Google is free. I know nobody likes to Google anything and everyone just asked questions in TikTok comments, but like, sometimes Google something. Sometimes Google's worth it. Anyway, back to the regularly scheduled part of this video. That was just a tangent that I needed to express. So Sofia Richie Grainge did something impeccably well, and she bridged this gap between having unattainable wealth and being an aspirational figure. Because it's impossible to deny that as a society, we often carry fascinations with the world of wealth. I think it's why we are so interested in the royal family, why people wanted to know so much about Will and Kate when they were at St Andrews, which is my current uni, everyone. It's why people cared about the tabloids of Harry being messy in his partying days, or why all of us, when we were younger, were obsessed with the Manhattan elite in Gossip Girl. It's why shows like Made in Chelsea or Rich Kids Going Skint have existed in reality TV, because there is an interest in wealth, especially wealth that the vast majority of people never get to experience. For many, Sofia Richie Grainge and her content have become a conduit to experiencing and accessing the quiet luxury aesthetic and lifestyle, and perhaps is also a conduit through which they are able to imitate the style without the social standing usually associated with it. But what does the rise in popularity of quiet luxury and the vessel of access that Sofia Richie Grainge embodies to it suggest about the political moment we are in? So from what I've posed so far in this video, it's clear to say that fashion trends and popularity in fashion can be linked to social discourse. So what social discourse and social commentary can we potentially consider in line with the rise in popularity of the quiet luxury aesthetic? Well, I want to consider the general feeling of the political landscape at the moment. Think about the conservative turn in the 2024 presidential election. Despite America being a country that prides itself on freedom, I think we can all say that in recent years, it kind of feels like their politics isn't really displaying that. The Republican candidate, Donald Trump, won the presidency, which means that he is going to sit his second term and final term of presidency after being the first former or sitting president to be convicted of a crime in 2024. Thus, this perhaps suggests a greater appeal to conservative politics than there is a repulsion to having a criminal as a president. And that's not even to mention how the Supreme Court rescinded Roe v. Wade in recent years, which enshrined the right to an abortion. Just for context, The legalization of abortion in Ireland didn't happen till 2019. America legalized abortion in 1973, and thus other countries have been fighting for the legalization of abortion and haven't even achieved it in some cases in the time that America has both legalized it and backtracked on it. And that's not even to mention the rise in don't say gay bills. I mean, did we learn nothing from Section 28 in the UK? The targeting of books in school and public libraries, which feature LGBTQ plus themes, which challenge norms, which feature things like witchcraft that go against the Christian church, or which advocate for challenging systems of oppression. And most recently, the targeting of the TikTok app, which was said to be done for national security. I'm not buying it, I'll be perfectly honest, because there is a threat that I think could potentially be seen to be posed by TikTok where people are able to share morals and viewpoints, political viewpoints. They are able to politically organize in terms of protests. So many of the Black Lives Matter protests were organized through social media. And there was also a level of community and camaraderie that was established not just between US citizens who may have been states away who otherwise would never have interacted, but also with US citizens and people elsewhere in the world, seeing how other people lived away from the perhaps propaganda that America is the best country in the world. On top of that, it has recently been announced that there has been a change to the Meta community guidelines, I guess you could say. So that's the parent company of Instagram and Facebook. That now means that hate speech will be allowed to LGBTQ plus people. Essentially meaning that people can discriminate, call people weird, or question whether they are mentally stable based on their sexuality and gender identities. NBC News quotes the new company guidelines as saying, "We do allow allegations of mental illness or abnormality when based on gender or sexual orientation, given political and religious discourse about transgenderism and homosexuality and common non-serious usage of words like weird." I'm not sure how we can denote being called weird for who you love or how you identify as non-serious. But okay. And then we can also consider the general election in July 2024 in the UK. Whilst we did move from a Conservative government to a Labour government, it has been argued that this is perhaps the most right-leaning Labour government that we have had, and that the price of Labour getting into government and getting into power was essentially kind of selling their soul to a more conservative Labour than it otherwise has been. And that's not even considering the economic instability we encounter every time that we see a headline flash up that mentions the cost of living crisis or the continuous threat of war worldwide, which just highlight the desire for stability in times of economic, political instability. And that also means that we often look back to times in the past that are categorically different or opposed to how we have progressed throughout time and begin to look back with rose tinted glasses. I mean, consider the rise in tradwife content, and I will say we can actually consider whether tradwife content creators really should actually fall under the category of tradwife, because by nature, having a personal brand and earning money off of the idea of being a trad wife kind of moves away from trad wives' identities being in the home and being raising a family, because they are personalities and individuals outside of that. But that's a different conversation to have, and perhaps that's a video in and of itself. Nevertheless, the rise in trad wife content highlights this rise in traditional family gender roles and values that we are seeing occur. We've also seen a rise in right wing and red pill content creators and podcasters, specifically directing their content at young men. And we're seeing this with the men's rights activists and the conservative conspiracy theorists. And as part of the rise in that kind of content, we're seeing conversations around the demonization of feminism, this need to be a real man, and the promotion of very toxic ideas of what masculinity actually is, and this push to more traditional gender roles in relationships and in marriages. Now, I feel the need to mention, and I hope we all remember, that at a time when traditional gender roles were far more popular and far more mainstream than they may be now, It was a time where rights were very much not equal. It was a time where women became trapped in marriages because they couldn't have a bank account without a man signing off on it, where marital rape was legal, where women may have been discouraged from having a job of their own, and thus they had no promise of economic stability or history of having a job that would help them apply in the future if they were to decide to leave. And especially if they had children, that potentially meant causing economic instability to their children. And it's not a surprise to say that at a time when these more conservative values were promoted, fashion was also more conservative. Now, do any of these individual examples I've given suggest why there has been a rise in the popularity of quiet luxury in recent years? No, they don't. I'm not saying that we've all turned to quiet luxury and now we're voting for Donald Trump. That is not what I'm saying at all. However, as I touched on at the beginning of this video, often fashion and the styles and trends of the time can speak to the social and political situation in which they are situated. And thus, the economic and political landscape can tell us potentially something about what fashion trends are doing, what they will do, or what we may look towards next. Similarly, am I saying that any of these events that I've noted on directly relate to Sofia Richie Grainge? No, no, I am not. Let's shut that down right now before anyone comments about it. There is not a conspiracy theory to be had here, not today. Instead, I am suggesting that the popularity and it girl status that she has garnered speaks to social context and consciousness that is in conversation with social interests. I think it's evident to say that fashion carries connotations of political and social feelings, especially because fashion is so innately linked into how we express our personal values, our personal style, and how that represents our value systems as a whole. It is almost impossible to remove fashion from the social context in which it exists. After all, certain styles and fashions have been synonymous with certain decades for a reason. They tell us something about the historical landscape of the time. It is through styling that we are taking implications of morality, personal politics, social status, and also just personal aesthetic as well. However, is fashion just an expression of personal standing within a society? So expressing personal values and the allegiances with the social group that an individual person finds? Or can fashion and the trends in fashion that we see suggest something about the movements and ideals of a society more broadly? I guess the question we have to ask is whether the rise of the quiet luxury aesthetic speaks to a style that is emerging and coming out as specific to this time period, or whether it is a style that has always and will always exist, that is just simply having its moment now because of a few key people engaging with it and thus rising its popularity. In simpler terms, is fashion and trends in fashion signifying just personal expression, personal interests, personal values, or do these moves between more conservative dressing, more wealth focused dressing, and virtue signaling through consumption patterns suggest a wider value system that is evolving and changing throughout time of society as a whole? In terms of aesthetic, a conservative turn isn't necessarily just being seen in the quiet luxury aesthetic, but it's also being seen in this turn back to more natural beauty. The dissolving of filler, the going away with the BBLs that were really popular in the last kind of 5 years. People can ask whether this is because, in general, people are becoming more conservative and thus those leading the beauty standards are becoming more conservative and leaning more towards a natural look. Or is it actually because those things aren't a status symbol anymore and it's more about social standing than actual personal politics? Because if everyone can access them, as people have begun to do with the BBL, does that then mean that those setting kind of the industry standard for beauty standards have to do something different to remain on top? So is this turn actually a conservative turn, or is it just turning away from what has become overly accessible? Is this an example of economic and political instability, meaning people are turning back to more maintainable beauty ideals? Or is it rather just that the people at the top want to emphasize the wealth disparity that they are at the top of and emphasize their privilege to change their aesthetic so freely. Personally, I think there's a clear distinction to be made between movements in social discourse and movements in fashion. In terms of quiet luxury, it is a style that has been around. It's a style that will continue to exist, but it has risen in popularity amongst what can be perceived as a conservative shift in politics, at least in the Western world. Thus, I don't think it's a coincidence that both conservative styling and conservative politics seem to have gained popularity at the same time. And that's not to say those who engage with conservative dressing or the quiet luxury lifestyle also engage with conservative politics, but rather the idealization of both in this particular moment says something about the state of society as a whole, or perhaps more importantly, reflects the dissatisfaction of many. After all, so often, what we idealize is not so much about our dream, but rather about what is in opposition of our reality.